Welcome to the Trust and Mae Podcast, where we have real talk and ask hard questions to inspire healing or just more trauma humor. Either way, trust Mae, it's probably going to hurt. So, let's get started. My name's Mae, and I'm in Houston, Texas. What a life I've lived. I feel like in so many ways I've lived 5 lifetimes, and I'm not even 40. But to really have an understanding of why I'm so passionate about having this podcast and where I want it to go, I have to start from the beginning. You see, I am currently an avid volunteer. I love serving my community. I love nonprofit work. I have been a volunteer with a particular nonprofit organization. It's a prison ministry that I have worked with now for over 6 years. After 5 years, 5.5 years of being a volunteer, going into actual prisons, sitting in groups for 14 weeks with inmates, offenders, however you like to refer to them, and doing this curriculum. It is a faith based program. It's not something that we use to go in and evangelize and convert folks. The purpose of the program is to help change the way the inmates think, help them identify some of their core wounds and find healing and restoring peace, learning accountability and responsibility. It's amazing. It's an incredible program. But after 5.5 years of being a volunteer as a facilitator, actually going in and sitting in these groups and facilitating discussions, I was invited to come as a guest speaker. You see, part of their healing and their learning involves them being exposed to hearing stories from victims of violent crime. Now, personally, I don't like the word victim. They do call me a victim speaker because I have endured, unfortunately, a lot. There's one story in particular that is uh, particularly relevant to TDCJ. And so that's part of why they had me come in and share my experience as what I say as a survivor of violent crime. Now, my whole story and my whole heart posture is really to focus on forgiveness. Yes, I share. I share in detail what happened to me because it's important. I think it's important to have a space for victim stories to be heard. But I feel like God has given me a calling, a purpose that is beyond just sharing how I've been hurt, but more importantly, sharing how I've healed and how I have learned to forgive and love even the worst of the worst, as we would call it in society. And I'm not saying everyone in prison is the worst of the worst. I'm saying plenty of us out here in the free world are the worst of the worst. But I feel and I truly believe that I'm called as a child of God to love. So, anyway, all that to say, it's through that experience that I learned the importance and the power of my story. I learned the importance and the power of having a safe space to have real conversations that are really hard and uncomfortable. So, to get to a point of really being able to experience that together, I have to go back to where my life began and some of the more impactful experiences that shaped who I was, who I am, and who I'm becoming. I don't have time, not in one episode anyway, to tell you all the stories of all the things that I've experienced. Maybe over time, because I've done some pretty cool shit. I'll be honest, like I've had a hard life, but God has been so good. I have been so blessed. So let's start from the beginning. My father is an immigrant from Venezuela, South America. My mother, she's indigenous. My family's tribes are based in Oklahoma. And I'm so thankful. I'm blessed to have both of those cultures because they both have impacted me in so many ways, for better and for worse. And there's just so much beauty through the pain and the oppression that both, um, I guess, the history of both and even present day. So I was born in Oklahoma in a Native American hospital. And as an infant, we moved to Venezuela, South America, because my parents ended up getting involved in ministry. And so we were doing mission work. I learned Spanish first, and after a few years, came back to the United States. And so by first grade, I ended up on a fifth grade reading and writing level. Fifth grade, y'all. So initially, they put me physically into fifth grade. And I still remember some of the book that I read because I think I was only in there for a day. Um, and everyone's staring at me because I was this tiny little 6-year old in a classroom with a bunch of, 9 and 10-year olds. And I think that my parents were worried about me having some challenges with social development. And my sister was in third grade, and I think that maybe she could have felt some type of way. So ultimately, they made the decision to put me back in first grade and figure out some other programs, gifted programs. And I like to joke, especially when I tell my story in prison, I like to joke that, jokes on them. They were worried that I'd essentially turn out to be weird. And I turned out to be pretty weird anyway, especially because I enjoy volunteering for free in prison with some of the what society would call like the worst of the worst, the lowest of the lows, the most violent of violent. And when I'm in there, honestly, I feel so at peace, relatable. I don't know. There's plenty of messiness out here. And so when I'm in there, at least it's like, to me, it's somewhere that you can't really pretend. No one in there is going to be pretending to be something they're not. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are all instances, layers of social everything. But I'm just saying, when I'm in there, I keep it real because I know the people around me are keeping it real. Like, who in there is going to sit there and pretend like they are some holier than thou, better than? And it's not that they're not good. In fact, I see through all of whatever sins and challenges and poor choices they've made, and I see the core of who they are because of who God says they are. And so for me, being in prison feels like a safe space. And that sounds crazy. So, parents, I love you both. Sorry, I turned out to be weird anyway. Putting me back in first grade did not prevent that from happening. So, here's the interesting thing though about my story is that I didn't realize how much at 6 years old being gifted and being in these programs and having this high IQ was going to have such an impact on my life because my father and my mother both are intelligent and hardworking. And I wanted so badly to emulate my father. I wanted to impress him. I wanted to be all the things that he was and more. He ended up getting into oil and gas later in my life and as an IT engineer and traveling the world and speaking multiple languages. And I just always felt like because I was gifted, because I was smart, I had a responsibility, a duty to fulfill. So, back to elementary. This was at a time in the 90s when my parents, because we were in the church, they were part of the Southern Baptist community. So, I don't know how much you know about the Southern Baptist community in the 90s or in the early 2000s in the South, but oh my Lanta, add the cultural overlays of expectations and hard work and education and control. It was a recipe for disaster. Don't get me wrong, I've got some good memories from my childhood. And my parents, they worked really hard to give us the best they could. Honestly, when I look back at it now, I recognize like they were doing the best they could with what they had and with what they knew. It just was really awful for some seasons and had a detrimental impact on my life and on my siblings' lives, some of which are still struggling today. So we were taught to be seen and not heard. We were taught to be a representation of Christ, a representation of the family. Because my dad was a pastor and a missionary, my mom was a missionary with him, there was a different level of perfection that was expected of us. And I recognize now as an adult how much those early formative years being trained to be seen and not heard, to be perfect, to really live up to an unrealistic expectation impacted and still impacts my life today as an adult. I am what I call a recovering perfectionist. And I very much love structure and routine. Not to the point of like being OCD and boring anymore, but definitely to the point of wanting to find that in so many facets of my life that letting go feels like letting go of control and sometimes can be a little bit scary. So yeah, back to elementary. It was a nightmare. And my dad was very controlling and abusive. He believed in spare the rod, spoil the child, believed that he was doing God's work. I believe in discipline. I would just never implement the kind of discipline that my father gave us to my children. So when they split, it was a huge shock. We went from being in the church 5, 6 days a week, never hearing profanity. TV was controlled, even music to an extent was controlled. Like our lives were so Christian and Baptist and legalistic that um, when they split and everything changed, it was so confusing. My father stepped down from the church. There were some things happening in my parents' marriage that were not conducive to a Christ centered marriage, let alone being an example, a representation of the church. And though we didn't have much, we had a very safe, clean home, and safe as in our neighborhoods, our communities were safe. So when they split and we ended up living in a community for Native Americans, that the best description I could give would be project style. Um, it was rough. We were exposed within a matter of months, exposed to so much of life and society and the world and the realities of it that we had never fathomed, never thought were real, or maybe not even thought about. If I'm really being honest, I probably didn't even think about those things just because we were so sheltered and controlled. I was the little goody two shoes, crybaby tattletale. Ask my siblings; they make fun of me to this day that I was such a crybaby tattletale. But I was also the best at holding my breath and tiptoeing through the house and making sure everything was perfect and clean and done. And I got straight A's, and my siblings would tease me and be like, "Why are you trying so hard? Like, if you would fail every now and then, you would get rewarded when you pass instead of getting punished for your 99 turning into a 96." Anyway, these are tangents, but these are little things that really, really like impacted my thought process. So we go from this controlled, structured, aquí mando yo y aquí manda Dios kind of lifestyle to chaos and violence and drugs, drive-by shootings. My parents pretty much never sober, and off and on, off and on. Then my stepmom comes into the picture, and that's this whole mess. And my stepdad comes into the picture, and he's abusive to my mom. So then we're choosing between staying at my mom's where my stepdad's abusive or going to my dad's where he's abusive. At least my dad's was still structured and clean, super controlling and super scary, but I craved that consistency and that structure. So my siblings had the realization that all of that religion and God stuff, it was a method for controlling us, for keeping us in line. And the thing is that I'm thankful for my parents introducing God to us as children, but not but and I wish they would have taught us the fullness of God, because we were taught so much how to fear God, how to revere God, how to respect God. But I never knew as a child, as a teenager, honestly, until later years of my adult life, I didn't know what it meant to rely on God, to trust God, to surrender, and just be loved by God. I felt so unworthy my whole life as a child, as a teen, and as a young adult that I didn't know that I could turn to God for anything other than judgment. So my siblings, kind of on their own, were just not really interested in continuing that overzealous, controlled Christian lifestyle. God had other plans for me. He was constantly pulling me to him, and I say it's God because there is no other explanation. Like regardless of what you believe, there is a supernatural world, okay? Whether you believe in the same God I believe in, I'm telling you the supernatural world is real. And for me, because I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, I know it was him drawing me to him. And I have to give him credit because there is no other explanation for how I ended up taking a bus by myself to church with kids I didn't know. I was, excuse me, not a popular kid. I was a nerdy kid. I was smart. I was in band. I was skinny with glasses, like bullied all throughout my childhood, bullied as a teenager, bullied in college, bullied as a grown ass woman in this world today, in the business world. Like, unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there with a lot of unhealed wounds that still come out in the form of hurting other people. But I digress. So I'm by myself, catching a bus, going to a church with a bunch of privileged ass kids looking around like, huh, what am I doing here? Here's the crazy thing about this supernatural world: there is a spiritual warfare happening all day, every day, all night. And I feel like at 13, no one took the time to talk to me about that. And I feel like even today, as adults, we don't take the time to talk to people about that and prepare them for that. Because the way a pastor of mine, an old pastor of mine, put it, he said, there is a spiritual battle happening every day you wake up. And every day that you wake up, not prepared for, recognizing, facing that truth, that reality, is every day that you wake up a casualty. And I, at 13, at an Acquire the Fire conference, you know, decided to give my life to the Lord. Come on down. The price is right. Bob Barker, the price for my salvation was right. And I was trusting so desperately that Jesus was going to rescue me from this nightmare that my life became, this fear that I constantly lived in, this abuse I constantly endured. I was just so confident that this Jesus was going to save me. But what they didn't tell me then, and that we need to tell more people now, is that yes, he does save. Yes, he does heal and comfort and bless us. But that spiritual warfare is happening. And the day that you choose Jesus is the day that you are choosing a side. And boy, did I choose a side. And did I go into battle unprepared? Because I was at 13. At 14 was the first time that I experienced sexual assault. My introduction to sexual intimacy was in the form of rape at 14. And unfortunately, it wasn't a one time thing. With that particular kid, it was more than once. And then eventually I ended up in a very toxic, unsafe relationship with someone who was an adult in college at the time that I was very much a child. Barely had my period for a year. Definitely did not physically look like a woman by any means. Was a 14-year-old baby in high school, having a long distance, on and off again for many years relationship with someone who was very toxic and unsafe. And unfortunately, because at home I wasn't experiencing love, I was experiencing physical and verbal abuse and instability. Um, I didn't know what it meant to be loved or worthy of anything other than what I have to offer. At home, it was cleanliness, it was perfection with school, it was taking care of my brother and sister. It was not causing a scene, not being problematic, being seen and not heard. In the real world, it was, not getting picked on too much, not being made fun of, not n- wanting to be desired and loved by boyfriends because I thought that letting them do what they wanted with me was love, right? If I give you this, if I serve you, if I provide this, then you're going to love me. And unfortunately, in case you didn't know, that was all a lie, right? I didn't know my worth. I didn't know that God loved me. I didn't know that I had a right to say no because I had been so ingrained, it had been so ingrained in me to be submissive and to be seen and not heard and to not cause a stir, to be perfect. And so anything that I felt like was tainting me or devaluing or shameful, I did everything I could to cover it up and hide it and continue to be perfect, outwardly anyway. Still got the good grades. I was doing advanced college work by the time I was in high school work when I was in junior high. Moved multiple times, like over 20 times before I graduated high school. We moved a lot. There was a lot of instability at home. And my whole life was just chaos. And the core of who I am and who I was, especially at that time, was just desperately seeking stability, love, and consistency. So any boyfriend that offered that, offered that, I clung to it at whatever cost. So fast forward to my junior or senior year of high school. In fact, this year will be 20 years to the date of when this happened. And I'm so excited because we are spending Thanksgiving with my mom's side of the family. We moved around a lot, and oftentimes we were away from my family in Oklahoma. As a child, I didn't understand the fullness of why my dad was so adamant about keeping us kind of separate from them. Now I understand. So when we had a chance to go visit for Thanksgiving, I was so excited because I didn't have a lot of connection on a consistent basis with that side of my family. And it just seemed so fun and cool. I was such a nerd. I was not invited to most things. The kids loved me, like all the small children, they loved me. And in fact, when we showed up, I'll never forget, all the kids come running out. They're so excited. I love the babies. And my grandmother's there. My uncle's there. He's the favorite uncle. He's the only uncle, but he's like that cool uncle that always somehow had like jet skis or a boat or something. We're like, how the heck? I don't know, but whatever. We're at this trailer in kind of a podunk area south of Dallas, and I'm so excited to be there. And it's my mom and my siblings and my grandma. She's being ugly to me. Oh, bless her. But she's just saying some ugly things about how I don't know what it means to be, or I'm gonna be. How did she say it? You're never going to be a good wife. You're never going to be a good woman for a man because you care too much about the kids. You spend too much time taking care of the kids instead of being in this kitchen cooking and knowing what you need to do for a man. Now, remember, I was trained to be seen and not heard. I didn't talk back. I didn't argue. But in my mind, I'm thinking, what is she talking about? I am a woman. I take care of my father's household. I cook, I clean, I take care of my brother and sister. I was the one making sure that they got to and from school because my dad traveled the world. He ended up going into oil and gas as an IT engineer after he left the church. And so sometimes for months he'd be gone. So I'm the one making sure they're getting their stuff done and being fed and taken care of. I had an older sister who, I had a couple of older sisters, but one in particular, she took care of the more legal financial things because she was an adult. But the day in, day out life, like that was on me. So I'm thinking in my head, like I've been doing that since I was a child. Literally started cooking when I was 8, taking care of a newborn baby at 9, 10 years old. And then I'm also thinking, by the way, Grandma, for 3 years now, I've been sexually active. Sure, maybe it wasn't always with my consent, but I know how to take care of a man. Like, what am I missing here? I didn't say anything. My grandma and I did not get along. And, but I was also afraid to speak up. I was afraid to talk back. I was still very much that crybaby, passive perfectionist. So, later in the evening, I'm hanging out with my uncle and we're having a great time, hanging out on the back porch, drinking beer. And what's crazy is like, I was such a good kid. I didn't have a lot of experience with partying and breaking the rules. Not that I never did. It wasn't my thing. I was mostly afraid of my consequences from my dad. He could be in a different country for months. And I knew that when he came home, he was still going to bust my ass for whatever it was I did wrong. And so there was a part of me that out of fear, I just didn't partake in a lot of things. Um, a lot. I did it a lot. Anyway, so I'm with my uncle. We're drinking, and my mom's like, "You better not be drinking beer if your dad finds out, right?" Because my dad's a disciplinarian. And, my uncle's like, "Whatever, chill. She's fine. Like, we're just hanging out." She comes back a little bit later and she's telling me again, like, "I already told you, like, you're not supposed to be drinking. You're underage." And, she was trying to put her foot down, but also kind of, she always, at that time, she had this kind of approach like, if you get caught, I'm just going to tell your dad that it was your fault. You ran away, you tried, whatever it was. She would say things like that. And so I understood that she was trying to be a mom by saying something, but at the same time, she was also going to kind of like wash her hands of it and let me handle whatever consequences came. I think obviously now, if she knew the consequences, gone, she would have taken a completely different approach. But time goes by, and my uncle is like, "Hey, why don't we go visit the neighbor to get some movies to have a little family movie night? Let's go get some DVDs." Now, mind you, I'm a teenager. It's late. I don't have a lot of experience with drinking. And had I paid attention, maybe I would have recognized why this was not really an idea that made sense. I'm not even sure that the rest of the family was awake at this point. But I was a kid and I was drinking. So when your favorite uncle says, like, let's go get movies from the neighbor, I'm just excited to go on an adventure. One of the first red flags was him putting his arm around me and making a comment about how beautiful I am, and one of my other sisters, how beautiful she is. And I remember thinking, like, this is my favorite uncle. Um, my only uncle on my mom's side, but my favorite uncle. I spent a few summers before that. I spent a whole summer babysitting his kids for him and his ex-wife. And I also remember thinking, like, if he thinks that I'm beautiful and he's comparing me to my other sister who I know is beautiful, that means something. And I remember thinking, I don't know the last time that someone other than a boyfriend told me that I was beautiful. And usually when the boyfriends said it, it was because they were expecting something. So when my uncle said it to me, it was like, oh, this is what it feels like to be loved. So I get in the truck, we go with him. I go with him to the neighbor, and I remember, because I have a photographic memory, I remember walking in thinking, like, dang, they got a lot of stuff in this house. And looking back, I'm like, oh no, we were just poor. We did not have a lot. They were normal. Um, but I left my uncle's house as his niece, May, on the way back to his house, because where he lived, it was a windy road. It's not like a house right next to each other. You had to, like, get in the car and drive over. On the way back, he had decided to pull the vehicle over and sexually assault me. So I woke up Jane Doe 132. That's my name in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice records. If you look up any records about it. And because of the upbringing, the training, the indoctrination I've had, my response was internal panic, pulling up my pants and crying softly. But I didn't argue, I didn't yell, I didn't fight. Um, I was used to being seen and not heard, and trying to control and be perfect and, pacify the situation. A lot of people talk about the fight, flight, or freeze response to trauma or to conflict. There's a fourth one that's not often talked about. It's the fawn response. Fawning is when you are making an attempt to appease the person that has threatened you or hurt you. Imagine like a baby deer, like Bambi with her little doe eyes, or his eyes. I don't know if Bambi's a boy or a girl, but the idea is that you're doing everything you can to create peace or keep the peace. Imagine it's a relationship with a significant other, and someone one of them is abusive, whether it's verbal or physical. Fawning response would be, "Baby, I'm so sorry. It'll never happen again. Let me fix it. I'll do this. I'll do that. Whatever you can to keep the peace." And that's essentially what I did. And there were a lot of really awful things that he said that night, that I'll never forget. And I remember getting back to his trailer, and all those years of training kicked in. I held my breath and I tiptoed through that house, took a shower, and I went to bed and cried myself to sleep. And the crazy thing is that the next day we got up, we were getting ready to leave, and I felt like everyone could see the scarlet letter on my chest. And I was so desperate to not be seen or heard. And I didn't want anything to stand out as awkward or different. And I did something that next day that took me years to forgive myself for. Years. I fond him like no other by volunteering to sit in the same truck, in the same seat that he had raped me in the night before. I volunteered to sit there and ride with him to lunch the next day because I was so afraid that if I did anything different, that somebody would know. So, fast forward, I go home. My father at this time is not in a great state as a father at all. And a few weeks later was the last time that my father hit me. He believed in using the belt. And this was an episode where he was whipping my back as I'm crawling away from him. And I remember thinking, like, I can't live like this. I didn't recognize at the time how much what had just happened to me with my uncle motivated my decision to essentially run away. It wasn't just my dad. I had to forgive myself and my father a lot over the years. But anyway, that Christmas break, I go out of town from Houston to Oklahoma to visit family, essentially my boyfriend, who was an adult. And we had the conversation over the break that, hey, by the way, you're turning 18. And so legally, you're an adult. You graduating high school early. You don't have to go back. And honestly, all I could think about was not going back to Texas, being as far away from anything that reminded me of all of that trauma and abuse and tragedy and violation. So I ran away. At 17, I made the decision. At 18, I followed through with it because I turned 18 over the break and began a very long uphill battle for my life after that. A few years later, I opened up for the first time about what happened with my uncle. And I had specifically asked my significant other not to tell anyone. It was hard enough living with it on my own, but to have the whole world know, I wasn't ready for that. Unfortunately, that wasn't the response that he felt was appropriate. And so it seems like everyone found out. And I'm getting phone calls, and it's just this big turmoil. And I had some cousins, I had a lot of family reach out. Some of them are like, "What'd you do? It's your fault." Like all of these really ugly things. But I had some that were like, "You too?" And I realized that though it wasn't him that had hurt them, there were others in my family that had been hurt by family. And I heard some stories that shattered my heart. One of my cousins told me that when she told her mom about a family member sexually abusing her, she was told to make him a plate to get his seat, his dinner ready after school when he came home or when he came over. And I just remember thinking, what? How? Why? In this same season, a lot of that family, because we're family and family doesn't snitch on family, have they have a very twisted sense of loyalty. And the idea of talking about our problems, um, let alone telling anyone, like that is just unheard of. You don't do that. You deal with it as a family. And so I got a lot of harassment, a lot of ugly harassment. Some people that I loved with my whole heart that I never imagined would turn their backs on me, turn their back on me. And I had a cousin who was a teenager at the time. She said to me, "Well, May, you learned your lesson." And I said, "What lesson is that?" She said, "You can't trust everybody." And I remember feeling gutted. Like, how cruel. And I think I even said, "I'm supposed to know that I can't trust my own uncle?" And I think she was a kid. She was repeating some things she probably heard. But the crazy thing is, that was the truest thing that anyone could have said. And I don't say that to instill fear and to cause people to walk around like in doubt and having trust issues, but I can honestly say that it's true. The Bible says, trust no man. Hell, it even says not even to trust your own heart because it will deceive you. So I panicked and I shut it down and didn't say anything for years. In 2010, so 6 years later, I get a message from a little girl, I think she was 13 maybe, telling me that he had molested her. It was her stepdad. My uncle was her stepdad. It was a new relationship, or maybe it was her mom's boyfriend, but essentially. Um, and she told me some things that he said to her and some things that he did to her that without me telling her my story, I let her share with me those details and I was able to conclude that what she was telling me was true because the similarities were so undeniable. And so I got into this mode of like, how can I do something about this? How can I support her? It's been years. What if something happens to someone else in my family? At this point, I had a new niece who was not quite a year old. And I'm thinking in my head, like, I have a responsibility, I have a duty to protect others because it's my fault this little girl was violated. Obviously, I know now that it wasn't my fault, but it took years to get to that point of understanding that the guilt and blame was not on me. So I make the decision in 2010 that I'm going to go to the police. And this was the beginning of an incredible shift in my entire life. And my sister, who to this day is one of my best friend of all my best friends, but one of my best friends. We always had a challenging relationship growing up because we were so different yet similar. And we took turns carrying a lot of the burden and responsibility of taking care of our brothers and sisters, taking care of our parents, and honestly, even bearing the burden of a lot of the abuse because we didn't want them to have to deal with it. So when this happened and I made the decision to go to the police, I was overwhelmed with gratitude and love because she chose without question to have my back. She stepped up and said, I will support you at whatever cost. And to this day, I feel like I haven't thanked her enough because I know that she made so many sacrifices for years to come. Today, still makes sacrifices to stand firm in what was right, to stand firm in her commitment to support me and justice. Unfortunately, my family did not feel the same. They lashed out at me, they threatened me. My mom turned her back on me. And I told her that if she did not support me in this decision, that someday my kids wouldn't know her. And she walked out. She wanted me to let him get counseling or offer some other form of support for him. And what are you going to tell his kids? And all these things that I look back now and I understand that, again, she was navigating from a very hurt, confused place. I don't excuse it, but I have forgiven her. And I understand that there were other details influencing her decision at that time. I still can't fathom how she did what she did. Um, and it hurt. For 6 years, my mother and I did not speak to each other. We were not in the same room unless we were crossing paths on our way out. And that was a challenge. So I go through this whole process of filing a police report, meeting with the detective. I had to go back to the general area where the assault happened because the county is so vast. They wanted to make sure that physically where the actual violent crime occurred was within their jurisdiction. At this stage in my life, I'm in my 20s, I'm in college, I had rebuilt my life. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through school. At one point, I lived out of my car. I slept under my desk at work. I was getting 2 bachelor's degrees. I was getting ready to go abroad for college. I had been abroad before with family, but this was my first time to go study abroad and live with a host family and experience Europe and all these amazing things. My life was just really blossoming when this wrench got thrown into the gears, I guess you could say. So somehow in the process of all of that, I am navigating this whole experience with TDCJ, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And being told by so many people, like, this is probably not going to go anywhere. You could have gone that night to the police, and it's likely that it wouldn't have gone anywhere. And I just had to keep my heart posture and my whole motive focused on justice and protection for others, for the babies in my life. There was no part of me that was seeking vengeance. I was hurt and I was angry, but at that time, more at myself than him, which is crazy. But I genuinely felt I was to blame for this little girl being hurt. Ultimately, she turned on me and said, "Oh, you tricked me and made me believe something that wasn't true. And he's the best father figure I ever had." And her mother turned her back on her and was supporting my uncle in this whole process. My family started, getting pretty aggressive with their threats, and It got ugly fast, but I was just in prayer and just focusing on my heart having the right motives. And the case progressed. Next thing you know, I am testifying to the grand jury. Next thing you know, he's getting indicted on a first degree felony. And the whole time, my mom and that whole side of the family is supporting him, paying for, visiting, doing whatever. And my dad, I will say, he never ever supported my uncle, but he was critical of me. Why didn't you do something? Why didn't you say right? Going back to the whole perfection. And it's like, who knows what to do in those situations? I mean, I do now, and I speak openly about it now, and I teach my friends and family and the younger generations now, but my culture, my family, my socioeconomic status class group, we didn't know our rights. We didn't know what to do. We were taught the opposite. You shut your mouth. Snitches get stitches. You don't talk about this stuff. And there I was, telling a world of strangers, trying to hold someone responsible, accountable, and going to therapy. Whew, I was the first to go to therapy, and that was a whole shit show that we'll get into on another episode. Fast forward and 3 years. Y'all, 3 years. This was not like I just went and told my story and confirmed where it happened and I testified and it all worked out. No, three hell filled, nightmarish years of me enduring all of the legal processes and conflict from my family and fear and nightmares and PTSD with unhealthy relationships in my own personal life and going to college, getting two bachelor's degrees at the same time. Eventually, I got married. I was 25. I got married. I had some stepchildren. I was trying to be a full time wife and mom and Christ centered and all these things while going to school and working multiple jobs and dealing with this. It's wild to look back and think, like, how did I do that? Today, it's just me and my pup. I mean, I have a job and all that. I do nonprofit work, but I'm freaking tired. Just me and my very low maintenance dog. Like, oh Lord, he was getting me through it. In that season, though, I learned about forgiveness. I learned A, how much God had forgiven me for. B, that I couldn't lose my salvation because I didn't know that till I was 25. C, I learned how much God loves me, but also loves everyone else. And the power of forgiveness, the freedom that comes with forgiving someone, and not just saying you forgive someone, but actually meaning it, but especially to say it if you have the opportunity. So, when he finally took a plea deal, he was getting ready for trial on the first degree felony, and at the last minute said, okay, fine, I'll take a deal. He pled to a third degree felony, prohibited sexual conduct. So, in case you didn't know, newsflash, guys, gals, it is illegal for you to have sex with your niece. And I say that in a sarcastic way because a law exists. Because apparently, at some point in our history of society, a law had to be created that specifically states prohibited sexual conduct. You're not allowed to have sex with your maternal, paternal, whatever niece. And we go to court, and I have a chance to give my victim impact statements where I get to go in front and say all the things about how your crime, your violence, your choices damaged me, affected my life, hurt me. And all that's true. I had a lot of damage, a lot of choices that I made for years to come that hurt me because I didn't understand my worth. I didn't understand, though I was learning about God's love, I didn't understand the depths of it. I sure as hell didn't know how to apply it for the way I lived. But I did go in there with one thing, and that was a heart of forgiveness. And I recognized that I had an opportunity to tell him to his face, an opportunity that I didn't know if I'd ever get again. So I did. I walked into a courtroom filled with inmates waiting for their dockets to be called, shackled to each other. And when it was my turn to go up to the front, I looked at him and I said, I forgive you. Because what I learned in this process of finding out God's love for me and my salvation, I learned that who I am without Jesus She sucks. She deserves death just as much as he did, just as much as he does. The thing about dying to self and choosing to live a life that really truly honors God requires you to really take inventory of yourself and be honest and keep it real with yourself about who you are. And when I did that, I recognized my brokenness, not from a place of shame, but from a place of understanding and appreciation for God's grace and mercy. I realized that sin is sin. And if you believe differently, hey, that's your prerogative. I'm telling you what I understand. Sin is sin, and I deserve death just as much as he does. But because of Jesus, I am worthy of love and forgiveness. I am worthy of so much more. And so is he. So I went and I told him to his face, I forgive you. And I pray that you get your life right with God for you and your children. But I want you to know that I forgive you and I give this to God. You could hear a pin drop until he chuckled or laughed, and his attorney smirked and laughed. When I walked down that aisle, out those front doors, I felt like Bambi with new legs, a little baby deer just born, wobbly. I don't know how I did it. And when I got outside on the front steps, I'll be honest, I nearly hit my knees to the ground because for a brief, like 2 seconds, I felt a fraction. And when I say a fraction, I mean a tiny fraction. I felt a tiny fraction of God's love on a scale that I have never experienced before. Because in that little 2 seconds, at the same time I felt this burden relieved from my shoulders, my heart broke for him. Because you see, I learned in this experience that at some point when he was a child, he had been sexually abused as well. I learned that in my family, I was the first in 5 generations to go to the police. So there was a part of me that my heart broke for him because I was seeing him through God's lens, God's eyes. Not that it excuses or justifies any of it, but it gave me compassion and love and heartbreak in a way that to this day I have not experienced at those depths, in a way that I can't fully describe with words, in a way that I also realize it was just a fraction because God's love is not something that I can even fully fathom, let alone describe. I walked away, and it's like, your life that's before some big incident and after. This one lasted years, but it was like that was the beginning of a lot of change in my life. I found my voice to the point that I was kind of an asshole. The Lord was like, okay, I empowered you. And I'm giving you strength and courage, but don't abuse it because that ain't me happening right now. There were some times that I would be so vocal and outspoken about injustice, and I was so idealistic, and all the years that I was oppressed and my voice was suppressed, it was all going to come out now. Yeah, that ain't cute. And the Lord was not having that either. So I have been working in the last 14 years to fine tune that and to speak truth and love and to be the salt and the light, to be bold and brave and vulnerable, but kind and considerate and loving. My life's been amazing since then. I have forgiven both of my parents. We have an incredible relationship now. It took years to get there, a lot of freaking work to get there, a lot of heartache to get there. And I never honestly expected it. And so some people are like, how could you forgive them? How could you forgive him or your family? But honestly, I couldn't. I had to have God help me do that. And sometimes that forgiveness, it's not a one-time thing and it's like, oh, everything's great and it's done. It's a consistent choice that I have to make daily for some of those people. And I also had to learn that forgiving doesn't mean accepting and allowing. I can forgive you and leave you exactly where you are and not have you back in my life. Like, I don't owe you access. So, forgiveness has been an incredible journey. It's an ongoing process. There are a lot of things about myself that I had to work really hard to forgive later in life. And though I've had some incredible experiences since then, and I've done more than I ever thought was possible, it It didn't come easily. And I don't feel that I have the ability, the authority to make anything easy necessarily for anyone else. But I do believe that I have a duty, I have an opportunity, I have a gift, a responsibility to encourage and to speak truth and to share with others. Because the greatest thing that can come from my suffering that I've endured and overcome is being there for someone else in their suffering, helping teach someone else how to endure their suffering, how to overcome their suffering. I can't stop the suffering. I'm not God. And even though God can stop the suffering, He gives us free will. We get to choose. And so there are a lot of choices that are being made every single day by us and others around us that are affecting us in ways that lead to suffering. But I also know joy and victory and success and surviving and overcoming and connecting. And I want so badly for more people to know how wonderful and valuable and loved they are. The truth about who they are without God, right? Like we got to keep it real. I am not cute without Jesus. I am a hot mess. But if I'm not honest about that, I can't fight that every day. I can't die to self every day because then I'm not actually owning who I am. I'm not owning who I'm fighting in the place of God. I want God to take that seat. I want God to be in control. I want God behind the wheel taking the reins. And so I'm here to just share some of my story. There's so much more to my life. So many incredible things. Like I have literally been starving and also had champagne at the top of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. Okay, I have been in violent situations, very much afraid for my life, but also hiked Machu Picchu from the base to the top of the mountain on the ancient Inca Trail. I have been counting coins to have enough money for food or gas. And I've also been in some of the most beautiful hotels, castles, a yacht. And not that stuff or travels or any of those things are really the purpose in life. What I'm saying is this world, this life that we live in, it is all things beautiful and painful, joyful and sorrowful, easy and hard. But we have community, we have each other. And for me, having God provide healing and grace and internal growth and comfort that I never could have had on my own. Like, I want so badly to have a space. I want to have these conversations. I want to teach people how to get to a point of understanding how worthy you are, how loved you are, and to understand that it's okay, that it's good to ask questions, to push back, to challenge the norm. Like I have a God that I serve that I know I can come to him and say, this doesn't make sense. What the heck is going on? Help me. Make this make sense for me. Because he is the type of God that's like, hey, I'm here to wrestle with you. I'm here to rumble with you. Let's talk through that. Again, not from a place of being combative and debate, but a place of fighting to understand, fighting to receive truth, fighting for that comfort. And God always meets you where you are. So I thank you for letting me share my story. And I hope and I pray that you're going to be encouraged to continue listening because I'm going to have some incredible, incredible guests that share from their experiences, their triumphs, their tragedies, their struggles. They're going to share the things that worked for them, that didn't work for them. I want to have conversations where we ask, what in the actual heck does this mean? What is going on? Why this? Why not that? But with the heart posture, with the desire, the motive to encourage and inspire and motivate as we walk through suffering together, as we celebrate in victory together. That's that's all I want. Let's have some real talk. Trust me, it's probably going to hurt, but it's going to be so worth it. God bless you.